The following is a production of Gearhead Media. All right, welcome back to the All Automotive Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Clausen, and we got a special guest today, and I'm really excited about this one. I know we've talked in the past, and I've had my brother and his friend Paul on the show talking motorcycles. Well, I reached out to one of my friends, Chris Kilmer. He does this sort of for a living. I'm not sure. We'll find out. And I ran into him. We know each other and know family members, and we have kids that were in school together, so we run into each other quite often. And he was telling me about this Yamaha he did, and it was an Enduro, and it was an older one, and we could sit and talk for hours, obviously, about this kind of stuff. So, Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, no problem.
To be here.
Yeah. So, I don't know if you heard my other podcast with my brother and his friend Paul. And especially Paul, he buys these older Yamahas and he buys older Enduro bikes, and he's got that Galera. And he's really into it, and I thought, man, what a perfect opportunity to talk to you. And I've got a hold of your YouTube channel, and I've watched everything that you've got so far. And man, it's nice to watch a YouTube channel that actually puts effort into doing things the right way, I would say. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I really enjoy restoring vintage motorcycles, particularly the Japanese vintage motorcycles. The bikes I come across generally are in pretty rough shape. A lot of them are headed to the scrap yard or being parted out and whatnot. So I work hard to get these bikes back operable and serviceable, and I do my best to follow kind of standard mechanical procedure in the process, and kind of try to do things the right way, the best that I know how and the best I can. It's always a learning experience for me, but it's a hobby that has just continued to grow and grow over the last probably over the last 3 years, and it's just something that I look forward to doing every weekend. It's a blast.
Okay, so this is something you're really just doing on the weekends. It's not a 9 to 5 thing, Monday through Friday.
Yeah, no, it's a weekend thing. I mean, I'm always looking up parts and ordering parts and doing that sort of stuff during the week, but majority of the work is taking place Friday evening, Saturdays, and Sunday afternoons.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I know when I've had a couple of different restoration episodes in my catalog, and one of the things that I talked to my brother about, and being that we both restore stuff and we both bring things back to life, what do you think is, talk about what's different between restoring a car maybe and restoring a motorcycle. So when you got, let's just say this VMAX and it was wrecked and there was some things that needed to be done. What are some of the steps? And talk about that. Talk about what some of the steps are that you go through to say, this is a bike that's XYZ years old. How do I get it to be on the road again?
Yeah. So first off, kind of one of the main reasons why I'm into the motorcycles is due to, I think, the space necessary, the tools necessary, and things like that. Once you get into car restorations, it's helpful to have a big shop with all the tools, the lifts,
right,
and a lot of that infrastructure, I guess you would say. Whereas my shop is a fairly small shop. I think last week I had 7 bikes I could fit into my shop. So for me, bikes tend to be a little bit more affordable to restore.
Okay.
And the space and the tools necessary to get the work done is a lot less than, say, a car. And I'm in love with motorcycles. I really enjoy them. I've been riding them since I was in 8th grade. And they've just kind of been a part of my life. I took a little hiatus from motorcycles when I was a younger father.
Right.
But as I've gotten older and I have a little bit more time, and I'm getting back into them. And so I've owned, I think, 26 bikes over the years. and almost all of them, there's only been one motorcycle I ever bought brand new off the lot. The rest of the bikes have been older bikes that need a lot of work to get rolling again, need a lot of maintenance to keep them on the road. And I find that I enjoy working on bikes a little bit more than I enjoy riding them. That's where my true kind of pleasure comes in. So I know I want to get back to your question, kind of what do I look for in a restoration project?
Right.
I really, to be honest, I look for the basket cases. I look for the bikes that have been wrecked. I look for the bikes that are listed as part bikes. I look for the bikes that have been thrown in the back of the barn or left out in grandpa's shed and haven't been touched in 20 years. I look for the bikes that a lot of folks might not look at them and see a lot of value. And those are the bikes that attract me. And my goal in every restoration is just to try to get the bike back running, get it in nice condition, get it mechanically sound so it can be used again and it can be enjoyed by whoever owns it. So that's kind of my criteria. It's a pretty low criteria, a pretty low bar.
Right.
That VMAX I drug home was in really rough shape. But I was excited to get the opportunity to work on a VMAX. So
absolutely.
It all starts with the bike, and almost the rougher the better. So that's my first criteria.
Yeah, and I mean, and when we were talking about the restoration part of it, and I've got kind of like a safety checklist that I kind of put everything through, and I funnel everything down, and we on a vehicle, it's not much different than a motorcycle, I would imagine. That okay, let's check out, like you did brakes. You had to fix the brakes on that VMAX, did you not?
Yeah. So with the VMAX, when I went to look at the bike, I picked it up in southern Indiana. I knew that it had been in a wreck. It was posted as being in a wreck. It was posted that it may still run. Being in a wreck, my biggest thing with a motorcycle that's been in a wreck is I want to make sure that the frame isn't bent up. I want to make sure the forks are in decent shape. And so there's nothing structurally wrong with the bike. So when I went down to check out that VMAX, I knew I was getting into a bike that I'd have to drag up onto the trailer and get home. I knew that it may not be running. But I did a once over when I was down there and looked at it pretty closely just to make sure there wasn't frame issues that I did not want to have to deal with. If the bike was bent up, I probably would have passed on that restoration.
Oh, okay.
The front forks, those were a little bit of a red flag for me. They were leaking fork oil out of the seals. I did not know. I mean, this bike is from 1999.
Right.
So I don't know if the seals are just bad from being original seals and for sitting for so long, or if the seals were bent because the inner fork tubes were bent from the accident. And that's why it was leaking the fork oil out. So that was a little bit of a risk that I had to take on that bike. But I had already done some research prior to going down and checking the bike out. I knew that serviceable forks were available to be purchased. They were going to have to be used. They'd have to be rebuilt. But if I needed to find a good straight pair of forks, I'd be able to do that. As far as the engine goes, that was a little bit of a risk. I did not see anything externally that told me that anything would be wrong with the engine internally. Most of the repairs look cosmetic. All of the hydraulic brake systems were bad, so I ended up having to rebuild those and bleed those through and things like that. But the biggest thing, I agree, safety on a motorcycle. I don't want a bent bike. So if it's bent up, that's going to be beyond me. Much beyond that, I'll probably jump into it.
Yeah, and that would be something that, those of you that are listening out there, take that advice to heart. I mean, if it's something that you have the ability to find another frame for it and you want to make one bike out of two, that's something that you certainly want to assess. And for us driving to southern Indiana, I mean, that's you were probably well past Indianapolis. And for us, and we live in mid-Michigan, so if you hold up your hand and you put your hand in the middle of your palm, and that's pretty much where we live in Michigan. So it all factors in. There's a lot of things, and you're right. And I love that point you made as far as, I didn't want to get into this thing if it was this far gone. So that was one of your things you wanted to assess. And I don't want to drive that far either to get, if you didn't have the ability to find those forks, and that's something that obviously with a bike that's not old, and realistically, it's not terribly old, and it's not as old as some of the stuff that, I've seen you put through your shop, and, there's some 1970 CLs 100 or something that you did.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. The CL, it was a 72 CL 125. It was my brother-in-law's bike. It had lost compression, I think, due to a valve issue. So we did the top end on that bike and had to seal up the gas tank on that bike. It was leaking, so I had to clean it all out and ended up brazing a few of the pinholes that were in the bottom of the tank. The exhaust had holes in it. The seat needed to be completely rebuilt. The front forks on that bike, it's just a little 125. Those were actually the most difficult forks I have ever rebuilt in any of my restorations.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just because it's your typical inner fork tube, outer fork tube, but then there is an external spring that rides on the inner fork tube above the outer fork tube, and then that spring is inside a rubber boot. And those forks have just rotted right in, and the inner fork tubes were rotted out and no longer serviceable. So I had to source another set of inner fork tubes for that bike, which was not easy to do. And then I had to take those down to a machine shop and have them chucked up in a lathe and cleaned up and make sure that, the run out and that they were straight and everything and could be used in the bike. So that little 125 presented a few interesting challenges to me. The VMAX, I have to admit, there was a little bit of an emotional connection to that bike.
Okay.
Which is why I was willing to take the risk to drive the 5 hours to get it. And the VMAX has always been a bucket list bike. I've never owned one. I've never ridden one. If folks out there aren't too familiar with the VMAX, just do a couple Google searches and you'll see what the VMAX is about. So, right. Most of the VMAXs that are out there have been maintained in very nice condition, and so they tend to bring top dollar in the used bike market. And I didn't want to have to save up a ton of cash just to get a VMAX, but it was still my bucket list. So when I found this one that was crunched up a little bit, I thought this is an opportunity. I can get this bucket list bike checked off and get this bike home and care for it and get it back on the road and experience it. So there, I was willing to go a little bit further for the VMAX than I say I would on another bike, just because it was one of those bikes that was on my list. I wanted to own a VMAX at some point in my life, and I finally got my VMAX.
There you go. Yeah, that like it's and again, if our listeners don't know, that was a very well sought after motorcycle in the mid to late 90s. Is that what?
I think it came out. I think it came out in '85. I think '85 was the Gen 1, the first year of the VMAX. It's a 1200 cc bike. It's a V4, and it was built purposeful by Yamaha to kind of be the final nail in the coffin of the superbike era for the Japanese superbikes, which started, I think kind of in the early to mid 70s, built into the early 80s, with the KZ1000s and the GS1000s and the 1100 specials and the V65s, all those kind of bikes. And the VMAX was supposed to be the definitive answer to who's got the biggest and the baddest muscle bike out there. The VMAX, one predominant feature which I was interested in experiencing is V-Boost. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the V-Boost, but
no, talk about that. I'm not really. I knew it was a fast bike, and everybody. And when we were at that age, and if you're going back to the 80s, then that's when we were, late teens, early 20s. And man, it was just like, that's the fastest bike, I think, production bike going, I think.
We will be back after a short break.
Looking for that special gift for that special someone this holiday season? Well, look no further than the soapshedshop.com. You know, there's beauty in simplicity. Soap Shed's handcrafted soaps and body care products are just that. Beautifully simple. All items are made with just a few natural ingredients, reminding us of the past when life was simpler and felt a bit more authentic. So shop now at thesoapshedshop.com. And you could pick from scents like Spring Sunrise, Rosemary Lavender, Love Charm, and my favorite, Old Time Barbershop. So take yourself back to when life was simpler and felt more authentic with the Soap Shed's beauty in simplicity at thesoapshedshop.com.
So it's 1200 cc's V4. The bank of carburetors sits in between the cylinders right on top of the engine. Incorporated into the intake manifolds is the V-Boost system. It's a series of butterflies. And so once the bike hits, I think it's a little over 5,700 RPM. I think an additional fuel pump starts to kick in. I could be wrong on that, but the butterfly system starts to activate so that one cylinder on its intake stroke is able to pull air and fuel from two carburetors. And so at that 5,700 RPM, you can feel a pronounced acceleration of the bike because each cylinder is able to pull two carbs worth of fuel and air. So, you know, as one cylinder is, say, on the exhaust stroke, a cylinder that's on the intake stroke will pull that additional fuel and air, and the bike takes off. It just takes off, and it's an amazing thing to experience. And on top of that, the bike just sounds good. The bike looks good.
It's very eye-catching with those side scoops, and it's not really like a ninja style cafe style bike. It's more of a
muscle cruiser.
A muscle cruiser.
Yeah. And so it was always on my list. I wanted a VMAX and I got one. So some bikes I tend to kind of fix up and then I'll move on and get other bikes. The VMAX is one bike that I'll probably just hold on to. That one's gonna stay. That one's gonna stay.
So I know that you work on some of these for people. Are you doing is this, I know the VMAX is going to stay home and it's going to be yours.
Yeah.
What are you working on now? You're working on that Honda, aren't you?
Yes. Yeah. So I haven't really done a lot of work for other people. Okay. The CL125, that was my brother-in-law's bike. I was happy to work on that for him.
Right.
You know, but most of any of the motorcycles that you see come in my show, I should take that back. I did work on my uncle's 250 dirt bike. That was the CR500AF. I don't know if you caught those episodes, but my uncle had a CR500AF. So if folks don't know what that is, the CR250, I think some of them, I don't know if all of them, but some of them had an aluminum frame. And so what guys used to do was to take the 250cc two-stroke engine out, and companies out there made a purposeful kit so that then you could bolt in
the CR500.
You could bolt in the CR500 engine into this 250cc aluminum frame. And that was just an incredible bike. I put a new expansion chamber on it. It was a Huga. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. A Huga pipe, custom made Huga pipe, new water pump, and then also an adjustable pickup for the stator, so you could do a little bit more fine tuning of the timing on the bike. That was a real cool bike. So I have worked on a couple bikes for family members. I'm not really taking bikes in from folks from the public or anything. So any of the other bikes that you see come through my shop and that are on my videos, those are my bikes that I've purchased, have been given to me. I've traded up for whatever it might be. So pretty much all these bikes are my bikes. And so I put a little extra time and care into them. And yeah, so the Honda. So I just picked up, it's a 1984 Honda CB700 Nighthawk. Ooh. And yeah, so I don't know if a lot of folks are familiar with the CB700. So Honda, a lot of folks have heard of, the CB750. That bike's been around, I don't know when this, 69, 70?
Yeah.
Anyway, that bike really came into its own in the early to mid 70s. My first road bike was actually a CB700 or CB750, I'm sorry. But I think it was in 1983, President Reagan put a tariff on all import motorcycles that were greater than 700 cc's. And so in response to that tariff, Honda decided to take their CB750, a very popular motorcycle, de-stroke it, which was able to then drop the displacement down to below that 700 cc tariff level, and then still sell this bike. The thing is, when you de-stroke it, you're able to wind the bike out faster. And so the CB700 actually produced more horsepower and more torque than the CB750. And the bike was only made for 3 years, 84, 85, and 86. And I don't think there's a ton of them out there. And so I was pretty fortunate to come across this bike and have it in my shop. And it's stuck in gear. I think it's stuck in first gear. It might be stuck in fifth. I don't know what gear it's stuck in. So
okay,
it's
I saw the last video. I saw the last video. It's a Nighthawk, isn't it? A Nighthawk.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. So specifically made for the United States, this bike. So he's right. There's 3 years, 84, 85, and 86. So if you can find one of these, it's very cool. Anyway, I just watched the episode. Your YouTube channel is CK Cycles, correct?
Yep. CK-Cycles. That's correct.
Okay. So CK Cycles on YouTube, and you can watch the latest video where he shows you how he rebuilt the clutch master cylinder on the handlebar, replaced, and then the slave cylinder. It kind of looks. It reminded me really of like a brake caliper piston.
Yeah, it looked like a single piston brake caliper.
Yeah. So while I was
it's very good design by Honda. Very easy to service the clutch system on the bike, or at least the hydraulic portions of the clutch system on the bike. The slave cylinder was pretty straightforward, easy to rebuild. And even though, rebuilding the clutch, getting the clutch operable, certainly that's not going to get the bike to pop out of gear. It's going to be a needed part that had to be serviced. Next step on that bike is I just want to get it running.
Yeah.
I want to get it running and see if that helps to free up anything internally. I'm really hoping shift forks or anything. I'm hoping stuff's not bent up on the inside, but more to come. We'll find out. Currently right now, I'm working on the carburetors.
Okay. And there's 4 of them?
4. Yeah. It's an inline 4-cylinder, air cooled bike, but it does have an oil cooler on it. The carburetors that were on the bike are in pretty rough condition. They could be saved. I think it would take quite a bit. So I was able to, an additional set of carburetors came with the bike that I'm working on rebuilding. I'll end up using those carburetors, but with every bike, you learn something new. So the carburetors, the replacement carburetors that I have are off a bike from California. And Yeah. So even back in the mid to early 80s, California, there were different emission requirements for each bike. And so I've had to do a lot of digging on this bike to try to figure out, okay, so what my bike, I think it's not a California bike. It's probably a Michigan bike, but the carburetors I have are from California. So what's the difference? What is my bike missing that the California bikes have? What portions of the carburetors, what gets fed into the carburetors that are different on a California bike than the other, standard bike?
Yeah, that'd be some good details for your next video.
Absolutely. So I'm having to do a lot of learning on the difference in the emissions.
My guess would be that it has something to do with the jetting, and they're probably way leaner than they would be if they were a Michigan carburetor. To reduce the tailpipe emissions, obviously for California, right. California emissions have been around for a long time, and they've gotten more stringent over the years. And it's just due to the, if you don't know what causes smog, then Google it. It's the NOx, NOx emissions. And the one way they reduce that is to obviously have computer controlled and electronic ignition or electronic fuel injection. But back in those days, it was, the carburetors, they probably leaned them out quite a bit. So I would guess that it's probably a difference in the size of the jetting, but that would be my guess.
That's a very good guess. And so from my research, I have found 3 emission controls on that bike. First one is a closed loop crankcase breather system, so the crankcase gets vented back up into the air box.
Yeah, and sucked in while it's running. Yep.
Yeah, so any potential blow by, can get sucked back up through the carburetors into the engine. Lean jetting is an emissions control, but the jetting was the same for both the California and the non-California models, from what I can tell. So Honda did specify that lean jetting was like one of the main emission controls for that bike, but it was the same for both models. What I have found is that the California model had I don't know if I'll use all the right terms, but a fuel tank evaporative gas collection.
Okay, sounded like a charcoal canister.
A charcoal canister, so that fuel that's evaporating in the fuel tank gets put through a charcoal cylinder and then gets picked up on the intake side of the carburetors to get fed back into the engine. And so that is what the difference between the two models that I have found so far. I'm still digging. I'm still trying to figure it out. So these California carbs have got extra intake ports. They almost look like small ports that say you would use to synchronize the carburetors with vacuum gauges.
Okay.
But there's actual lines that feed into that from the charcoal canister that comes from the fuel tank.
Okay. So they're just sucking the fumes off. So they're not going out into the ozone layer.
Yes, I believe that's what it is. So, with every bike, one of the big things that I really enjoy in my restorations is learning this stuff.
Yeah.
Out of the 26 bikes that I have owned, there's only been one repeat, and that was a DT250, a Yamaha DT250. Other than that, every single one of the bikes has been different, because one thing that I really enjoy in my restorations is learning about all these different bikes, learning what's special about them, why were they manufactured, what niche, whatever, that bike was designed to fulfill, what are special features about it, get it running, get it on the road, ride it, experience it, and then move on to the next one.
Yeah.
There's a few, like I said, bucket list bikes that I'll never let go of.
That sounds like kind of one of them. I don't know. I might be troubled to give that one away because I'm a Honda guy. And so a quick lesson in evaporative emissions. It's it's really the a primitive form of what the evap system is on your vehicle today. It just takes those fumes that are on the top of the gas, and it sucks it from the gas tank into. So I would imagine it's got a different gas tank. It's got lines that go to the gas tank that suck that through, and then those carburetors have those extra ports, which make them unique in themselves, but you have to have something to connect it to. So what they're trying to do is reduce the ozone depletion because they found that gas fumes are deteriorating to the ozone, correct? And that's why they're doing that. And they started this back in the 80s when everything was going crazy in the smog, and scientists were figuring it all out. So yeah, that's really interesting. And then to add on to that the bike was only made for 3 years, and that it was made specifically to get by a tariff enforced by our government. So interesting. So that one's a keeper too, it sounds like. I would get that thing running, and that would be one of the weekend warriors for me.
Yeah, the CB700 is a very interesting bike. I think it's going to be a keeper. I do have a replacement gas tank sitting in a cardboard box. I think the tank was off the same California bike that the carburetors came from. So I'm going to be interested to, when I get to that point where I'm beyond the bike running and the mechanical issues solved, I'll be interested to pull that spare fuel tank out of the box and to take a look to see what the differences are between the two tanks, because I think this additional tank probably has those additional features to be able to, feed the vapors back down to the carburetors.
And it's important. It was there on purpose. So let's leave it there so that it uses its intended function, so that it'll function correctly. And especially, the aesthetics. And when we're talking about restoration, and me and my brother have had this conversation before, it's just like, well, when I bought my 68 C10 and I was telling him what I had in mind for it, and he was just like, well, what engine's in it right now? I said, well, it's just a 250 straight six with a 4-speed in it, and it's got creeper gear and whatever, it's hot shifts on the floor and all that kind of stuff. And he was just like, man, you should leave that in there. Not too many, he's more on the line of, it came that way and I'm going to restore it that way. And my thing is I have all this knowledge in my head on how to retrofit an LS style engine into this truck. And I have the knowledge of putting the computer controlled systems on it so that it's fuel injected and install the fuel pump and all that kind of stuff. So I have that kind of knowledge, and that's the kind of direction I wanted to go. Although I did for a moment, several moments, several days or weeks or whatever it was, I was thinking about, well, maybe I can put an EFI system on it, or Holley EFI system on this little straight six, because it does run, and it does run good, but it does. It's, it was tired, and it just, that's not the direction I wanted to go. But, we've had that conversation, and with this particular motorcycle, you're kind of in the same position that Paul's in. He's like, I can't just swap in a Honda a Honda XR 100 engine to this Galera, then it's not a Galera anymore. Yeah.
I'm going to do my best to keep this bike the way that it is intended. I'm still working through what I need to do to the California carbs to make sure they work on this non-California bike correctly. I don't think I've sourced a charcoal canister and all of the necessary system parts to make the evaporative fuel collector functional. We'll see where I end up, though. Yeah, we'll see where I end up. At this point, I want to get the bike running, and I'd like to see what I need to do to get it out of gear. It's stuck in gear, so those are my two big priorities right now.
And it's a very cool looking bike too. And back in when those bikes were made when I was just getting ready to drive, and man, I'm looking at one. I Google searched it while we're talking, and I've got this picture up, and man, I'm just like, this is really cool, and it would be so cool to have one of those, and I'm kind of jealous about that. Number one,
They made a blue one and a red one.
yep, I see that.
And I have heard, I don't know if it's true, I've heard the red are a tad bit more rare than the blue. I could be wrong in that. So I got my hands on
go to another friend of mine his brother-in-law works at this website called bringatrailer.com. You can search for all kinds of stuff, and there's one that's for sale on bringatrailer.com. So we've covered all kinds of stuff, and man, it's just so nice to talk to you because we kind of have the same kind of thought processes sometimes. So talk a little bit about your YouTube channel and how you tell people where they can go, and then tell them how you approach each of your videos so that you're not just Billy Bob saying, what we're going to do is, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, so my channel, it's at CK Cycles on YouTube, CK-Cycles, pretty easy to find. I think there might be like a bicycle shop out there also named CK Cycles. So you might have to, look for the guy that's wrenching on old motorcycles and you'll find my channel. But I started my channel about 2 years ago when I picked up my 77 Yamaha XT500. I had done just a couple of like little videos on, Facebook and sent them out to my Facebook friends. And a couple of my friends said, hey, you should like restore that bike and do it on YouTube so we can follow along. And so the XT500 was my launch into the YouTube world. And that it has been a vertical learning curve to try to produce decent videos that people will watch and kind of be interested in. I realize none of my content will ever go viral. I'm never going to be like this big time YouTuber or anything out there.
But so it might. I mean, you've got some pretty good content, and the thing for me with YouTube is there's so much stuff that's I hate to say it, but some of it is just not good. Yeah. And if you're creating quality and number one, you're doing it from the heart and you're doing it, you can tell that you're invested in making the best that you can do with the time that you have, number one, and number two, it's not just this is how you do it. This is just a video of me doing it.
Yes.
And sometimes, and I've learned a lot from videos that just show this is what we're doing today. We're not telling you this is the way to do it, but this is how we're doing it. And if you want to be a keyboard warrior and put your comment down there about how we could have moved this out of the way so we got that bolt out so it only took an hour. No.
Right.
There's a certain way that I do things, and I'm sure there's a certain way that you do things. And sometimes, videos like yours, I really appreciate.
Yeah. I've tried to, like I said, it's been a learning curve. It's always a balance for me since this is kind of a big time hobby for me, not only working on bikes, but then also trying to collect video footage of working on bikes. And that can be challenging in itself. So I'm having to learn lighting and camera and audio and setting up certain shots so I can show certain things. I really try to capture in my videos steps or parts of a restoration on this specific bike that I think I would like to show other people.
Right.
So it's, if there's something kind of like my next video, I am taking a little bit extra time to explain this whole California carb issue on the CB700, just what I have learned,
Right.
But it's always a balance for me. It's I've got a little extra cash. Do I spend that on motorcycle parts or do I spend that on a specialty tool that I need? Or do I spend that on upgrading a camera or upgrading my audio or
Right.
upgrading my video editing software. So it's all these things I have to try to keep in balance. I try to produce content on a somewhat regular basis. I was trying to do weekly videos there for a while, but that got extremely taxing, very difficult. So I'm trying to shift focus and to do much more high quality videos that have detail in them, and I kind of explain what I'm doing, and to be real purposeful about my video setups. But it's a constant learning curve, and as for the comments, by far, a lot of my comments so far have been very supportive. Every now and then, you will catch somebody, coming after you a little bit, and I try to address that with as positive of an attitude as I can, and just keep the content going.
Right. And I've had nothing but pleasure in watching all of your stuff, and simply because it's like, you got me, I'm a captive audience, because I've got half hour, usually 3-4 days a week while I'm walking on the treadmill or using the Stairmaster. For me, it's what is he doing now? And then, and I have the same issue with this podcast. It's like, I feel like once a month is right now is what I can produce and do for my audience at the very most. Because I still do have a 9-to-5 job. I still am running a shop, and I'm still a very busy person outside of this podcast. This podcast is my labor of love, and I try to do everything that I can with it. So I totally agree with you there that it is something that I want my listeners to look forward to that next month when I put out something that's of quality, rather than just every week, me and Chris are sitting down and we're talking about motorcycles again. It's, oh my God.
Yeah.
But and then for me, it was like, okay, so I run an automotive or a all automotive podcast, and I've gotten a couple of questions about how come you don't do a video one, or that takes, it takes me a good amount of time to get everything all put together, scheduled, just like with us, it was, back and forth about what the time was and what we were going to do. And then we had to change the time, and it's all things that a lot of people don't understand, but it does take time because we are one-man shows when it comes to our content and so forth. So it's like, I only have so much time. And when you're saying you're working on stuff on the weekends, the weekends get to be filled up pretty quick. And when you're spending 2 hours editing a podcast that you put out every month, I know it doesn't sound like it's a lot, but it is, because, I've got to come up with certain things, and everything's got to sound the way I think it needs to be sound. And the main reason why I don't do a video style podcast is because I have a face for radio.
Oh, come on, man.
No, that's my excuse. That's what other people tell me, but no, it's just the amount of time that I think extra that would go into that. And maybe once I retire or I get more time on my hands where I'm able to do some more things, that might be another step on down the road. But man, I really appreciate you coming on and talking to me today and telling your story about restoring motorcycles. It's really cool because there's so many similarities with restoring cars, and I always like to talk to individuals like yourself and other people that work on cars and stuff to get their particular steps in what they do, and taking the time and taking the steps and doing that stuff. So, and like I say, I appreciate your YouTube channel, CK Cycles on YouTube, people.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Matt. I really appreciate it, and I can talk motorcycles every day.
Just like me, I could talk cars every day. So
absolutely,
it's nice to have a different style of content. And I know we've talked about motorcycles on a couple of different episodes, and that's where I was like, oh, I got to have Chris on the show, and it would be so cool. And then we could promote your YouTube channel from this podcast so that maybe some people could navigate over to your site and take a look at that and see what you've got to offer. And if they're interested in our podcast, they certainly would be interested in your YouTube channel.
So again, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I really appreciate you being on the show today.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, that's going to do it for another episode of the All Automotive Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Clausen. Big thanks to Chris Kilmer for coming on the show today, talking motorcycles with us. Be sure to check out his YouTube channel at ckcycles at youtube.com. All Automotive is a production of Gearhead Media. Until next time, I'm Matt Clausen saying, hey, keep that greasy side down.